I'm going to be very brief.
And then we're
A long time ago, a federal judge told me brevity is A long time ago, a federal judge told me brevity. Behalf of the Board of Christian Social Action, which has our chairman here, Alan Vanderlinden, and our chairman-elect, Jason Dreckman, both in attendance, to welcome you to this event. This actually is a continuation of an endangered middle class meeting that we had a year ago, and we thought more than it's our entire society that we need to be and I am so pleased to welcome today Dr. Bruce Levine right here. He'll be coming up here shortly. You can come up right now if you want. As part of this three-part program on how we got into the situation.
Mic off. There we go.
How we're going to get out of it. He's going to tell us his interest and how he get involved. So I'm going to comment just briefly on his book. I found this book at a boutique bookstore in Los Angeles. I like to go to the bookstore. Just about but helping us.
Mike.
Just boom it out.
Can you use this?
Just use your voice and go.
Helping us try. After the Board of Christian Social Action decided to have this program, we started out first at the suggestion of our Minister of Community Engagement to have a book review of Bruce's book. Thursday. And Bruce, some of those are in the room, so there are people in the room that have actually read your book. Take the stage, she's going to talk for a little bit, then do a Q&A on that section of the presentation. And when it comes to the Q&A part, Mary Ritchie is going to facilitate that. And then for the last segment, as far as what we can actually do, we're going to be giving some examples from Carrie Craig with Iowa Citizens for Community Involvement, and Joan Fermetti, a former church person that's big into hunger, and Paul Turner, who may or may not be here. He has a what? And I hope your daughter has a good concert today.
We're waiting for the text.
So I'm going to turn it over to Bruce. And again, thank you all so much. He knows that it's more than a saying, it's the way we work. Whoever you are, wherever you are in life, you are welcome here. I think the doctor already knows that about our church. He does know at least about the gas prices that changed when you crossed the river.
Thank you. I'm going to just stand here. I'm just used to standing and talking. I've been looking forward to coming out here for a while for a few reasons. One is we're going to just have a lot of time here to delve into the book, and other reason is I know some of you have already read the book, so that's kind of exciting for me. We're going to have more info. For those who haven't stand up, it's really a book about American political passivity and really what we can do about it. What we can do about it, strategies and tactics, but also here today. Talk a little about how it is that activism. Also, too, I don't. With that. Spring of 2011. So take you back. That's sort of the time of the Arab Spring was coming out. And so people in America were really thinking, like, well, maybe it's time for us to have democracy here, too. And so coming out, I had no knowledge at all until after the book came out that the Occupy movements were being organized, because they started getting organized during the summer of 2011. And it turned out some of the Occupy groups really got into originally with Occupy Washington, D.C. Flower. You might remember who she is. I see a couple of head shakes. She was her big thing was a single payer Medicare for all, and she got arrested for civil disobedience there in front of us. Well, her and her partner, big organization, and we friends with Washington. Other things happened to the book was that when I came out and around a little while, they had a library there, an Occupy Wall Street library, and so I was pretty happy to find out my publisher, Chelsea Green, they donated 100 copies of Get Up, Stand Up to the Occupy Wall Street library. Chelsea Green has become an employee-owned company in the last few years, so I'm pretty proud of that. And they're a pretty significant independent company there that has had some New York Times bestsellers. In late November 2011, I get this email from my publisher, from an assistant there, saying, "Bruce, you have to take a look at Democracy Now!, yesterday's broadcast." So Democracy Now! And so I went. You can look at it if you go to my website. You can scroll down the media and you can get to it now if you want to take a look at this thing. But it's November 28, 2011, and the segment was the New York City Police Department, Zuccotti Park, where Occupy Wall Street was, and they threw all the books, thousands of these books, into dumpsters on their way to incineration. And the Democracy Now! They zeroed in on 2 books that they threw into the dumpsters. One was this black, tattered copy of the Holy Bible thrown into the dumpster. It was like they were making a point, It was like they're throwing the Bible in here. And then the other copy, as you could guess, why my publisher was so if you were an author and you're an activist, it's sort of, you have mixed feelings about that, because it's like, wow, that's an ego trip. But also you're going like, wow, this is not good. This is the kind of beginning of the end of Occupy Wall Street. And just to finish this story, a couple of weeks later, I was doing an interview, media. You do a lot of media the first year a book comes out. And so what I was doing is this podcast with this guy out of New York, a comedian, this guy named Lee Camp. And actually, George Carlin's daughter has anointed Lee as the next George Carlin. But Lee, we were talking about the New York City Police Department coming into Zuccotti Park and throwing the dumpsters and all that. Well, Bruce, you're on the right side when the other side is burning books.
Yeah.
Anyways, to switch gears a little bit, to talk a little bit about how I wrote this book. It might be interesting again for some of you who are not only activists but folks who are writers and artists, and just how careers unfold just by doing what you really care about doing. You don't know how one thing is going to lead to another. And I always had an interest from way back, even when I was a kid, for not only psychology but politics, history, sociology, and how all these things intersect. And way back when I was an undergraduate, way back in the 1970s, there were more psychologists who thought about that kind of stuff. Erich Fromm is probably the most famous bestseller, Art of Loving, The Sane Society, talked a lot about how if you have a kind of dehumanizing insane society, people adjusting to it may not be such a great idea, And so that idea was once talked about a lot, but it's sort of forgotten a lot, especially among clinical psychologists, among people who work with patients. And so I wanted to revive some of this. And so the first nonfiction book I published was a book called Common Sense Rebellion. And that book came out in 2001, and it was really about A was for ADHD, C was for chemical dependency, and E was for education, J was for jobs. And it was about how all of these things sort of interacted, and about how a lot of our kind of dehumanizing institutions were part of why we were having these huge explosions in mental illness and mental disorders. And so one of the chapters in that book was the D chapter, was depression. About this. It turned out everybody in America, well, pretty much a lot of people were depressed. And so the working title of my next book was actually called "So Who's Not Depressed?" And it ended up being, which I like better, but the publishers changed it to "Surviving America's Depression Epidemic," which was about depression, and that came out in 2007. And that book really, for me, was a book for the people I write for all the time. But a lot of these people I run into who are these critically thinking, anti-authoritarian, depressed people, the typical treatments weren't working for them, even the antidepressants, even the standard psychotherapies, and I wanted to kind of give them something else. So that book is primarily a self-help book, but it's about 20-25% talking about how society and culture creates depression. And so there was a few things came out of that ultimately lead directly to Get Up, Stand Up. One is some of the models of depression that I talk about in that book, which I'll talk about a few of them here today, really parallel political apathy, okay? And part of the thing is, I was trying to help people sort of like discard some of what they've been hearing in drug commercials for the last 15 years, which has actually been proven not to be true by the 80s or 90s, that serotonin imbalances are related to depression. This is just kind of marketing propaganda. That research actually disproved this already in the 80s and 90s, but it really depressions really well. The things that with depression are much more common sense stuff, that it's like if you're unemployed, you're twice as likely to be depressed. If you're on public assistance, you're 3 times as likely to be depressed. If you've come from an abusive relationship in your life, significant trauma, some studies show 12 times more likely to be depressed. If you're in a really miserable marriage, you're much more likely to be depressed. If you're isolated, completely alone, if you're in a lot of physical pain, if you're going through bankruptcy. So really a lot of what depression is associated with is overwhelming pain, okay, of different varieties, emotional, physical, financial. And a lot of what people do is just to not be overwhelmed by that pain and go crazy, is to just shut themselves down. They just shut themselves down, and so in shutting down the pain, though, they also immobilize themselves. So this becomes an important thing as we talk about political apathy, too, as we get into it. But the other thing that also came out of that Surviving America's Depression Epidemic, it was also published by Chelsea Green, who published Get Up, Stand Up. And the kind of lucky thing for me was that they don't usually do these kind of books like that. They more do things like permaculture and how to build a straw house, and they're much more that green. They were green before it was fashionable, but they had all these contacts with online magazines that I got to write for. So, for example, they had contact with Huffington Post. They were pretty big, but not gigantic. And so, Huffington Post, Arianna Huffington said, okay, you could be one of my bloggers, and I'd get a little password, and everything that I submitted they would publish. When AOL, I should tell you, bought Huffington Post, everything changed. Lots of stuff got censored, lots of stuff they wouldn't publish anymore. That's a whole other story. But other contacts they had were for Alternet. I don't know how many of you read Alternet. It's a pretty significant progressive online publication that nowadays, a couple of 100,000 people read that a day. Writing for them, and Truth Out, and Salon, and a lot of these different Counterpunch, a lot of these different ones I started writing for 2007, 2008. And so what that provided for me was this platform so that I could see if other people thought it was important too. So that led to directly get up stand up. Because at the end of 2009, one of the things I was thinking about I wrote this article that first came out on Alternet called "Are Americans a Broken People?" just to see what other people. In that, I talked about some of what I talked about in that second section of Get Up Stand Up, although I didn't document it as much as I did in the book. And the thing, it's a lot that we think about American political passivity, but one thing kind of really triggered it that wasn't going on here even in America. It was like in Iran, of all places, where we've been told totally election in 2009 in Iran. I mean, all countries, most countries have elections. I mean, Saddam Hussein had elections. It's, elections isn't necessarily democracy, but they had elections, and Ahmadinejad was the winner. He declared himself the winner, and the more progressive guy, although the guy wasn't super progressive, he was still approved by the clerics. His supporters were really upset, and they were told by the Ahmadinejad government, don't protest, don't go out on the streets. But they didn't listen. There was like 2 to 3 million people went out on the streets in Tehran protesting, got shot at, some of these people, got arrested, a lot of them. And I started thinking, like, wow, those people are not pacified. Like the somewhat more progressive guy, Obrador, he was defeated in a disputed election, another disputed election, and the people, 2 to 3 million people in Mexico, all that kind of stuff. And throughout the whole decade, there were other instances like that. And then I thought about America. What do we do in our disputed elections where our somewhat more progressive guy gets defeated? What I wrote about was the election of 2000, where to the rest of the world, we really looked like a banana republic. I hate to say this, but we really did. For a couple of reasons. One is, I mean, indisputably, Al Gore had a which the world doesn't really understand that much. But even within that electoral college thing, there was this close contest in Florida, if you might remember. And what happened was there was a recount going on that the Florida Supreme Court had approved. And, all of a sudden the U.S. Supreme Court, which had been states' rights, well, when it came to Florida, you have no states' rights, and they basically handed the election over to George W. Bush. And I was just going like, wow, and then more sort of inflammatory. One of the Supreme Court justices who was dissenting was so appalled, disgusted by his fellow Supreme Court Justice, John Paul Stevens, who was not a radical. I mean, he had been appointed by Gerald Ford, a Republican, but he was still so disgusted. He said, we'll never really know the winner of this year's election, but as an equal guardian in the rule of law. And I thought to myself, I remember thinking, like, wow, what are the American people going to do? This is a Supreme Court justice saying, like, basically, you have no democracy here. This is a sham that's going on. And what did we do? Almost nothing. Almost nothing. I mean, there's a handful of people at the Supreme Court when they were deciding it, and then Bush's inauguration, you had some people protesting. But I thought, like, wow. I mean, I wasn't like this huge, big Al Gore fan. Okay, another guy. Wow, there were 50 million people, over 50 million people who voted for Gore, and they were just kind of taking this. It was like, okay, so did Gore. He just took it. And then I thought about other things for the whole decade, about the war. A huge thing that I thought about. Here, these wars, they were really, for me, really interesting because as these wars became more unpopular in the polls, there was less resistance. This didn't make any sense. in 2003, early 2003, if you take a look at before we went into Iraq, the polls showed the American people slightly favored going in because they bought the government's idea of that there were weapons of mass destruction. Enough did, all right? So the polls showed slightly favoring it. But even with that time in February 2003, there was enough people out there who were upset by this. There were huge protests in the United States. People forget, there was like 500,000 people in New York protesting, over 100 cities. In my own city, Cincinnati, where Bush came to announce, George W. came to announce the war because he felt it's a pretty safe, pretty conservative place. There were 5,000 or 10,000 of us on the protesting. Was as people found out, well, they didn't have weapons of mass destruction. I guess we went in there for another reason, and the polls showed 65% of people opposing these wars, the resistance stopped. And in Afghanistan, as people originally, most Americans were favored going in there because they were told it was about getting bin Laden. Well, after they figured out, American people, this wasn't about getting bin Laden. In fact, even after that, there was very little resistance, and this was striking for me. And then there were other areas too. The whole Wall Street bailout that happened in 2008, massive opposition among the American people, and very little resistance, especially on the left, until 3 years later. There was some resistance, and so there was issue after issue. And so I wrote about that in the article, detailed it in that second section of Get Up, Stand Up. And then, but after I wrote that article, there was so much reaction that I've got. And then I said, I needed to write a whole book on this, okay? Because I didn't get into what I got into the other aspects of the book, what was causing this passivity, and also, most importantly, what can we do about it? That's the most important aspect. I mean, what can we do? How do we get our energy back to do battle? What are strategies and tactics that we could use? So that's what I went into writing the book. And what I want to do in this first is into what I talk a lot about in the third section of the book, which is what are the spokes in the wheel that created this American political passivity? How did that talk about energy to get our energy back and strategies and tactics? Okay, so in that third section of the book, how we learned helplessness, what I start with is how human beings get pacified. All right, and some of them have a lot to do with what psychologists knew about how people got depressed. I mean, a lot of this stuff is very common sense stuff that people knew about how we got before sort of drug company kind of took over my professions in psychology and all kinds of other things about chemical imbalances. But one common sense things that we learned, that we knew, was this idea of learned helplessness. Okay, that the idea that you can learn powerlessness and learn passive experiments that they did in psychology in the 1970s, which animal rights groups, but they had groups of dogs that were getting electroshock, equal amount of electroshock, and take their nose and press a panel and stop the shocks. And the other group, no matter what they did, they had no control. They experimented with just stop it. And what happened was the groups state of helplessness, they looked depressed. They just whined and whimpered and did nothing. And then they put both of these groups into a task, okay, where they were put into a box, shot, and if they just explored the box and jumped over that short barrier, they could escape the shock. Well, the dogs that had learned helplessness, they just whimpered and were depressed and didn't even try. They didn't explore, they didn't do anything. And the dogs that learned that if they could stop it, they had power to stop it. Like learning helplessness, it explains a lot of, it's one other model of like why people really kind of give up. And we'll talk about how that. But one of the sort of really sort of things of America is this learned helplessness that applies in a lot of our institutions. But even in the one area where most Americans think that's where our democracy should be, right? a lot of Americans put all their democracy eggs in that basket as being, that's where democracy is. And they come away with a feeling of not getting their lives other than democratic control. And they go, there's a Republican office, and there's unnecessary still control and unnecessary wars. Third parties don't have much of a chance anymore in America because of them. You still get a major party in office, and you get corporate control and senseless wars, and you get a lot of those people, like what happened in 2000, a lot of Democrats really Bush is what they would tell you. And then other people just stay home. 40 to 50% of America stay home. A lot of these people are not unintelligent. They actually validate this lesser of two evils, pseudo-democratic ritual, and so they stay home. But what do they get? They still get unnecessary corporate control. And so the strategies I get into in the fifth second is that it's a mistake to spend all your time thinking politics and democracy, not to forego it. So I'm not telling people to work. That doesn't either. And so, do what you want to do. Vote for the lesser of two evils, third party, whatever you're. That's a couple of things. That's a couple of things. Our energy, because that's where people have sunk all their energy in. And so part of what Get Up, Stand Up's all about is go ahead and do what you want to do in terms of these electoral processes, but think there are other democracies. What that means. Principle of like how human beings move into getting depressed and becoming pacified and apathetic is just being abused. Okay, any mental health professional, okay, who's ever worked with people who are depressed or anxious, at least in the old days before every. If you talk to people for any significant length of time, you'd want to find out whether, if you're in an abusive relationship with a parent or a spouse or a boy, a relationship just really a relationship where you're treated with no respect, no caring. And so if you stay in that relationship, you internalize the fact that you're not worth respect, you're not worth any caring. You just become pacified. I mean, that's the classic pimp-prostitute relationship. They wants that abusive relationship so that prostitute doesn't go away. There's ways kind of spousal abuse and parental abuse that we can get abused by what I call the corporatocracy abuse, sort of battered people syndrome, And for those of you who haven't read the book, the corporatocracy is what is the kind of ruling power of American society. It is what it is the banks, insurance companies, with these and they're politician, basically lackeys in a lot of ways. Not every politician, but that's pretty much what people sense. And I throw that term out, I should tell you, whether it's left anti-authoritarian kind of people or libertarians or even a lot of mainstream media, and nobody really disagrees. No one tells me, oh, Bruce, you're completely wrong. That's not the way it works. Most people sort of comprise it. I don't get a lot of people disagreeing with me on that. So part of what we'll talk about in the next segment is like, well, what do you do with this battered people syndrome, this corporatocracy abuse? But I do in that third, a lot of different ways that we are pacified: fear, surveillance, television, the decimation of fear. Let's just stick to an area having to do with young people, okay, for this first segment. And just a little backdrop on what about that, the areas that are become a special concern with me. I thought about it, again, before I wrote Get Up, Stand Up, but since I've written it, I thought about it even more and more. I remember, I didn't see this, it's not in Get Up, Stand Up, there was a poll that I saw of 8:30 3-year-olds, asked them about, well, do they think Social Security is going to be there for them, when they're ready for it? And 76% said no, it's not. Or if the government says, and instead of like fighting to make sure the very wealthy, they're getting taxed on their second, $300,000-$400,000. They just buy into this stuff. And there's lots of other things. I talked to some young people who are activists on college campuses, and I asked them, well, you got a lot of friends there? And so there are young people who are activists. You see them at the Occupy movements, although a lot of people at the Occupy, they were who were middle-aged, my age, older. So this became a special thing that I thought about. It's like, wow, have they really been able, which is in the history of democratic movements in America and other places, human rights movements, democratic movements, it's been young people at the front. So a separate article about, which I call 8 Reasons Why Young People Don't Fight Back, to just see how other people felt about that. And it became this big #1 story. Then other websites picked it up. And another website that I'd never heard of, which you guys, if you have never heard of it, it's a really cool website called filmsforaction.org. On there. But they also have articles. They picked it up. And this went, like last time I looked at it, over 700,000 views. And I get people emailing me like every week, a few people still from this. And so there's a bunch, like I said, there's 8 reasons I talked about. There's probably more, but I want to just go through a few of them here in this first segment. Again, a lot of the way I'm thinking, it's like what we can do in the regular, everyday life, turn this around, And so hopefully we're going to start right now, and with a couple of these areas about how young people, number one, it was which I deal with. Well, in the book, I say the average student loan debt is $25,000. Now, I just took a look at that. It's a few years ago. Now it's over almost $30,000. You've got $80,000. They graduate with their $600, $800, $1,200 a month monthly payments. Even if you're not on the left, if you're a Republican realtor, house. That's what they're having to use to pay. They can't buy a house. That's what that month, that student loan debt payment. And so it's this huge thing that really, myself, when I was growing up, wealthy folks, they would go to these private colleges. Their parents would pick it up. If you were working class, like I was, you'd go to public universities. And all the way through and out of the City University system in New York, Queens College, and University of Cincinnati for my PhD. I'm in debt back in those days. If I had the kind of debt that these kids, it would have changed my whole life. I would have gotten out, and I would have been much more controlled by fear. That's a huge way. More than fear, you're not going to move into any kind of activism. And about with that kind of was a lot. You're not going dissident activism movements. No, you're thinking much more. It's like I have these bills to pay. And so, what can we do about that? Well, there's a couple levels that you can. Classic political level, which is that people need to be going to their state representatives and saying, like, wow, you've got the rate against crime. And we have to do something about it. But on another level, I think the other thing that I stress and get up, stand up, is that there's every day too, which I do in my practice and I do with young people I meet, which is I talk to a lot of folks who are 17, 18, the world with 10,000. Don't think about what the difference in monthly payments and all of these kinds of things. And so you start talking to folks early on it. I do. Is half the kids who go to these folks, they don't even have college degrees when they came back. Sort of propagandized in a lot of ways. They in the schools that you could get into, all right? And so they're going to like Kaiser for some reason. Michigan State instead of going to Ohio State. I don't even understand this stuff, but they were paying out-of-state fees and doubling. And so I sit down with young people and I say, several, hundreds of articles. No publisher, no editor has ever asked me like where I went to school. And they look at me and they go there. And so I had no patient ask me really where I've gone to school. So a lot of what you can do as a mental health professional, a teacher, if your teacher's out there, but just grandparents, uncles, aunts, and how you can help them either reduce it some or even eliminate it. So that's a whole other area that we get into. I just want to make multipliers and of getting these kids back some sense of fear, of taking away some of their fear is a huge part of what we need to do. Another area that I talk about in that article is several with their and one particular area of how their schooling has become more fear-based. Teachers, this is like standardized testing. Bottom line for just really has created fear. And fear is anti-intellect. It's anti-educational. You can't have real education when you have fear. You can't have fear. The kind of it radicalizes people who aren't radicalized with a lot of teachers. It's just making school correctly unfun for them. They're terrible. They're going to get fired if these kids don't pass these standards. So it's a total fear-based system. And so, again, the good thing about that is I see activism happening off of that. That Chicago teacher strike, and a lot of it was they said, they knew kids, parents, everybody really hated the standardized teaching as assessing them. And that they made that front and center issue, and they got public support for that. There's a district, I don't have Warfield High School, that the teachers just said support. We're not going to give these proficiency exams. We're not going to spend all year long teaching to these things. We want to really have these kids care about learning. And so they just didn't do it. And they won. They won these battles. So those are kinds of things when you're thinking about how to get energy to do battle. Talk about and I get up stand-up that I want to finish with in this first segment before take a break here, get some questions, is my own competitive some of these other profession is vital for a lot of reasons that they talk about their thing more. And the reason that pathologising rebellion, and ultimately what psychiatrists, the mental health increasingly doing. In 1980, a new mental illness was created called, and by the way, how these mental illnesses come to do with science. There's a group. So you sit around and they basically figure like, well, what behaviors upset them the most and what will most Americans be upset. I mean, it's really what's good. And you'll see when we get to the third segment about how homosexuality mental illness, how it got abolished. But in 1980, they decided in this DSM, which is their Bible, the American Psychiatric Association Diagnostic Bible, that they created oppositional defiant. The symptoms of this are often argue with adults, often refuse to comply with adult requests and rules, I mean, for most Americans, it's like looks like a teenager here. Is what they pathologize. And I remember in school at the time, and I saw this, and I was embarrassed. I was embarrassed by my profession. And I said, don't you realize if you take a look at every great American activist, they would have all been ODD, and not just activists, artists. One of these oppositional defiant disorders, disruptive behavioral disorders, a lot of great business people too, innovators they were, rebellious folks. So I was going like, what are we? Non-compliance, non-rebellion. And it got scarier over the years because as it happens, anytime something becomes a mental illness, eventually it becomes drugged and medicated. So a couple of years ago, there was this, and they talked about among kids 13 years and younger, there was a 7-fold increase in them being put on antipsychotic drugs between 1993 and 2009. And what was even scarier, well, these antipsychotic drugs are things like Risperdal, Zyprexa, Seroquel, Haldol. They're the heavy-duty tranquilizing drugs. And what was even more scary for me about that article was that they said of these kids, the majority of them, 63%, were being drugged with antipsychotics, and they weren't antipsychotic. They had these disruptive behavioral disorders like oppositional defiant disorders. So they were being put on these heavy-duty drugs for that. And this is actually more the case for foster kids. I mean, you'd be hard-pressed to find, nowadays in America, foster kids, poor kids, they're even being controlled with these drugs even more. So this was scary. And what I talk about when I go to a lot of different groups of activists out there was that even if you don't care about this as a mental health professional issue, you don't care about it the same way I do, you're not embarrassed by the profession, you should be concerned as this is a huge spoke in the wheel why young people may be being kept off democracy battlefields. I mean, you're drugging rebellious kids before they even achieve any political business. And so that seemed to be problematic. Is I talk about it, like I'm talking about here, I talk about it on the radio, I talk about it in media, but in my practice itself, I have folks who have been dragged in by their parents, who've been labeled by other psychiatrists, parents, you have a stubborn kid, you have a non-compliant kid. These kind of kids, a lot of them are the hope of the nation. Not only are they not mentally ill, they're the hope of society. And that, we have to kind of just learn, they may be a pain in the butt in your household. There's no doubt about it. But there's things to do besides drugging them, really there are. So, and part of what I'm here to deputize all of you here is that, and not even if you're not mental health professionals, I know there are some here, but he just as, again, parents, grandparents, uncles, aunts, to kind of delegitimize some of the authority of my own profession, the mental health profession, in terms of these diagnoses, not take it so seriously, and use your own common sense. And if you're encountering some young person who you feel like is a pretty cool young person, who's like thinking, but they're stubborn and rebellious, is to help them, and say, hey, look, there's nothing essentially ill with you here, and to talk to folks to try to help them not be medicated. So there's things that we can be doing. Like I said, that's the point. Even section before I get into specific strategies and tactics, and energy back to the second segment, talking about there's things that we could do even when we just understand all these spokes in the wheel. So what I want to do here, is I'm going to stop here, and like I said, in the next segment, get into what I talk about in the fourth and fifth sections. But what I want to do is, folks want to get a drink, get a cookie or whatever, or they want to ask some questions here. We can do that for, for 15 minutes or so, and then I'll move into the second segment. But pretty much just, you can ask me anything, I'll make comments about anything, but to know where I'm going to be talking about next, and just if you want to just kind of stick to what we've already talked about. But you're going to help me there?
We do have a microphone, so.
Question is, will it cooperate?
So,
Nope.
there we go. How about this? No? The suggestion about a break is a good one, and let's do that after a few questions and take the break in about 6 minutes. So, questions?
I probably don't need the microphone. Yeah, I've noticed
But we can't be able to do if we just do it. It seems like that's a large number. Is that what you see? I mean, is that I cannot figure out. They can't meet their basic needs. That.
Well, it depends. Based on criteria, and also what people define as basic needs, and so you have to kind of just take a look and sort of see exactly what they mean by that criteria. But there are clearly a lot of folks out there overwhelmed emotionally, financially, and one of the things too that I should say that came out of that Occupy movement, I didn't get into a little bit of details, was that it people in terms of Manhattan talking about this whole issue of income inequality and the 1% and 99%, and in the last election in New York and the mayoral election there, I mean, the guy de Blasio ran on the idea on this idea. People rich who are like, life is just swimmingly fine, and there's a ton of people who are struggling just to survive. And he won in a landslide. I mean, the guy had over 70% of the vote. So there's a lot of people that feel that identify with this idea that there's just really kind of two groups in America. There's no more middle class, or very little middle class. There's these folks who are just rich and life is easy, doing whatever they want, and then there's, if not 99.
Yeah, I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about. I'm thinking about your idea about and relating back to Thomas Frank's comments about what's the matter with Kansas and this phenomenon of working poor, rural poor who are voting for Republicans even though they're voting against it.
In terms of United saw that my sense was maybe a little that for a lot of people there's not much difference between the Democrats, like look, there's corporate control, but so they would vote culturally. They would vote more like on issues of like abortion or something like that, choice, pro-choice, and some of those kinds of issues. Big issues. Because there are some issues that really Democrats really were different than the Republicans, and so for a while in America, that could get you elected. Pro-life, pro-gun, or whatever, and so that those folks again, people like Frank and other folks say, well, you guys are voting against your economic interests here by voting for the Republicans. Insult. Like calling him stupid. I mean, not that he did it that way, as opposed to more like saying, like, well, I could see how you could see that, like, that these guys are both like sort of like controlled by the same corporatocracy here, and you care about some of these other issues, so it looks like your Republican guys are going to give you that, and that's I think what happened. So part of what what I'm talking about and Get Up Stand Up is if you want to have folks understand what real deal populism used to be all about. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. And it had nothing to do with voting for some kind of Republican corporate. Yes.
I just finished reading a book by Tom Carter called The Crash of 2006. Speaks about how we forget after the 80 years is pretty much a lifetime, and then those people who remembered, for example, the Great Crash passing on, and so that we don't remember, we don't learn from the past. Could you speak, do you have a sense of how we can room to move to these lessons do repeat themselves if you look at our history.
I mean, it's a great question about like why, young people, like a sense of like the union movement has been in American history, as opposed to like now, like there is almost no union movement. Like only like 12% of people are in union, percent. Young think like they're these Jimmy Hoffa corrupt kind of places, and they don't have any kind of sense of what's happening. And so a lot of, I think, people, it is a kind of it's a kind of educational counter-propagandizing thing for folks to learn. Number one, that in the American history, all kinds of democratic movements have been successful. Human rights movements have been successful, and it's just part of it is having folks, having them understand that, and I think it becomes like a focus again for young people. I think is you've got so many folks who many. It's back. There's some successes somewhere that they can actually change certain things. I should say Hartman, by the way, you mentioned Tom Hartman. He's an interesting guy. He was a guy who actually started out as sort of more mental health professional kind of guy, and one of his early versus Hunter of ADHD as a disease, actually. There was a book talking about like there were these kids who would have normally been hunters as opposed to farmers. So it's just sort of a thing about Tom Hartman that a lot of people don't know as he moved more towards progressive politics. Yeah.
As a young person involved in a lot of activist circles, I find it really interesting that one of the things you talked about positions, the millennial stereotype I think that we run into a lot of, oh, well, your generation doesn't really care about these things. So where do you see that sort of rhetoric of laziness and not being involved playing into this sort of passivity or forced passivity?
Well, I'm glad you. I'd say, like for me, if I was a millennial, I was growing up, again, just with the issues of student debt and loans and all that kind of sort of stuff. I mean, it might have put me in a mental hospital if I would have known, like, I'm just impressed that all you guys are walking around that for, some, like, parents at a particular time, money, which might have to do, or, so I'm impressed with the resilience and the hardworkingness of millennials, and I think that other generations before them, especially baby boomers like my generation, but all the other greatest generation, every generation, I think has really shafted your generation, hasn't really cared very much. And so I'm glad you really brought that point out, because the vast majority, 95% of the comments on that article about 8 reasons why young people don't fight back, totally got what I was saying, that we should feel bad as older generations to like what kind of position we put younger people. But there were some folks, younger folks, who read that article, and they had a little bit of the reaction, just like you're blaming us for being lazy. We've done this, and that, and that's certainly not the way I feel. And there's certain things clearly that your group, has done, certain kind of the stuff on internet freedom. Where it hasn't taken enormous amount, a certain kind of energy, there has been certain activism that has gone on, even though your generation has been like incredibly crippled by all of these things. Like I say, nothing more than. I mean, when I was talking about the student loan debt, I mean, what was the impact on you?
Well, I'm not personally affected as much by student loan debt, but I have seen, I go to a private university, so I go to Drake, and it's right in the neighborhood, and I've seen the crippling impact that it has on people who, my friends leave, and first of all, a lot of these nonprofits are struggling in this economy too, and, a lot of these people, the other issue is internships. So, when you leave with and you're paid internships or jobs with an unlivable minimum wage for 5 years, you're not getting out of it. It's just getting worse. I've seen it happen to so many people at my university and that's for sure.
feel like this is where you go with debt, and then you just. So I have like a section that Get Up Standard where I talk about comparing guys like in your generation to like indentured servants. I mean, in some ways it's worse because those guys were done mostly after 7 years. Like, you guys are like, so I mean, do you have like? And I was thinking too for folks who don't have student that. I mean, do you like some survivor's guilt because you don't? A lot of these folks do.
Well, I think it's like with a lot of like issues like this. I think with student debt, it's recognition of privilege is really important. I think recognition of privilege, whether it be racial, economic, or any other gender privilege. I recognize that I am a privileged individual, and that's why I'm not struggling with student loan debt. But the important thing that I should be doing is educating myself about what other people are going through with these issues. Because our university doesn't like to talk about it, you know what I mean? Because it's a primarily white campus. So, they don't talk about this. John's not struggling with student debt. What issue are you having with student debt? I say, okay, everyone's not me, you know what I mean? But we have those issues, and I think it's important to talk about it. I think it's more important to learn about it if you don't know what it's like. You know what I mean? It's more important for the privileged to understand than it is for those who educated.
Well, just to connect with what you for sure. Our families, our professionals on top of that, for which we got significant scholarship support. Student debt every month as we spend on our mortgage. And then and that's for one time. Now we're going to spend twice that on child care. So welcome to the next chapter. That is the child care. Right. But we make good money, but our budget is it because everything else goes out to child care and student loan payments.
Good setup for the next segment.
For those of you not familiar with Plymouth, the bathroom, they're down the Jordan. And then reconvene so that we can have the benefit of the next, which is the strategies. Thinker, and
I'm gonna go grab me a cookie, but I'll leave this live.
A lot of my friends honestly aren't struggling with student debt, and most of my friends, our parents are paying for most of our college, and that's just the truth. But we have to realize that that's not true for everyone, because they would prefer we live in that bubble. You know what I mean? Because if you believe no one's struggling with student debt, you're like, oh, what are you activists talking about? You know what I mean?
But they also about many.
Oh, yeah. As white people. And it's such a benefit. so much how that's the PTA they would and cutting. It's the reason we are successful politics. And even though it doesn't, I'm not a very financially affluent person, but in my experience, at the right, and a lot of people say, oh, the athletic hard, and this, and that. Right, to some extent, but it also a lot of the fact that, you grew up in the Midwest, the fact that, team athletes, we have all these privileges, and they're important to acknowledge.
I'm Kaylin.
Nice to meet you. I'm seeing a lot of people. I'm from this church, but I'm seeing a lot of people here that I haven't seen before.
Yeah, the last time I was in here was when a group from this church invited people from my mosque to come over here, and then groups from this church have come over to the mosque for something, and we have a get-together at dinner or whatever.
That must have been more than 2 years ago.
Yeah, I think it's like,
Almost 2.
Yeah, it's been a while since I was last over here.
Well, he's interesting, isn't he? I almost didn't come this morning. I thought, on Saturday morning, I just want to lie around. But I'm glad I came.
But when I saw that in the email, I am on this, so